Dream Deferred, the legacy of busing, is sponsored by your Northern Ohio Toyota dealers.
I'm Leon Bibb. Tonight, a history lesson, one that has left an impact in Cleveland classrooms for decades.
I'm Curtis Jackson. Court-ordered busing sought to find the balance between social justice and education reform. But did it work?
I'm Deborah Lee. As we honor Black History Month, we'll try to answer that question in a special half hour. Dream Deferred, the legacy of busing.
Few policies have had as controversial an impact on education in Cleveland as the one implemented 35 years ago this year. Court-ordered busing. The remedy for segregated schools fell short of many of its intended goals. It sought to bring the black and white communities together, yet instantly divided them. It envisioned a future in which there would be no more racially identifiable schools. 3 decades later, Cleveland public schools remain predominantly African American. So what went wrong? To answer that question, we must first take a look back. Birmingham, 1963. The civil rights movement confronts the most segregated city in America. It is a flashpoint in our nation's history, one that would ignite demonstrations across the country and begin the movement's slow migration from the South to the North.
I, as a white kid, born in Cleveland, went to John Adams High School. I didn't think they had any racial problems here. They were all down there.
Before 1963, race was an afterthought for most whites in Cleveland. It was economics that shaped life in the city.
The city I knew when I was a kid had more than 1 million people in it. And it had a very bustling downtown. And they were making steel. And if you got out of high school, you could go down and get a job with your back. Make a lot of money. The air was polluted, and people said, I don't smell pollution, I smell money. Right? That's the way it had been.
Good-paying factory jobs lured blacks from the South to the North during what was called the Second Great Migration. By the 1960s, the black population in Cleveland had nearly doubled. Many weren't just coming for work. They were also fleeing Jim Crow, the racist laws that made blacks second-class citizens in the South. But discrimination did not stop at the Mason-Dixon line.
The minorities migrated primarily from the South to places like Cleveland, Boston, Detroit. They were restricted insofar as the areas where they could live.
Segregated housing meant segregated schools. And as more blacks moved to Cleveland, their elementary schools became overcrowded.
Just accommodating their natural needs would be somewhat stressful.
How the school board, and to some degree the black community, dealt with overcrowding would chart the course of education and race relations in Cleveland for the next 40 years. School officials first launched a controversial relay program.
In the black community, they would go on half-day sessions. So black students were basically deprived of 50% of their educational day.
Relay schools outraged African-American parents who, inspired by Birmingham, began to picket the school board.
The pictures that came up from the South probably gave some people the idea up here that maybe this is how you get things done. I remember at least one unforgettable occupation of the school board building in which people went in there and pulled the sit-in and then finally dragged the sit-in protesters out.
The Board of Education will take what steps are necessary to accomplish this meaningful integration, and by next fall.
The demonstrations forced the school board to build more schools in black communities. It was a catch-22. New construction may have been a remedy for overcrowding, but it also reinforced segregated housing. Opponents rightly believed this was a direct violation of Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, the landmark Supreme Court decision that made segregation unconstitutional, hence illegal.
The Constitution says what it says, and if you read Brown, separate by definition is inherently unequal.
But a federal judge disagreed, and when school construction moved forward, opponents went back to the picket line. In 1964, Pastor Bruce Clunder led a demonstration in which he laid down in back of a bulldozer. The move cost Clunder his life.
they made a wisecrack, which was not funny, and called it Clunder's Blunder. It was such a stark idea that this guy, who was a minister, who obviously wasn't out there to throw rocks at anybody, and then being run over by a bulldozer.
Clunder's death would not stop construction or hinder policies that promoted segregation.
The practices of the school district to maintain intentionally segregated schools included things like building schools in a segregated manner, that is, in neighborhoods where they would reinforce segregated housing patterns. Busing was used in order to maintain and preserve segregation.
Busing, which would stir so much anger in the 70s, was first used as means of dealing with overcrowding. African American students were transported to white schools with space, but they were kept in isolation.
We went straight to the classrooms, and that's where we stayed the entire day, other than when we were escorted to the restroom.
We would come in when the other children in the school were already in their classrooms, and then we would leave before the other children left their classrooms. So there was no mingling between the classes at all.
The system of racial containment in housing and education was de facto segregation, or segregation in fact. It was different from the de jure segregation of the South, where racist laws were on the books. Ultimately, both produced the same outcomes. By 1964, tensions between blacks and whites had reached the boiling point. In Cleveland, both sides clashed during a school protest in Little Italy.
These were whites that were rioting in Murray Hill when they found out that black kids were being bused in Murray Hill Elementary. They rioted, and looking back on that now, you know, it's so kind of odd that whites would riot because of black kids arriving, kind of like what was going on in the South.
As was the case in so many cities, the 60s ended in a rage in Cleveland. Riots in Huff and Glenville followed, but there was also hope. The late 60s saw the election of Carl Stokes as the first black mayor of a major American city.
We thought we'd solved racial problems. I mean, we said, oh man, this is it. You know, just like they said when Obama got elected, this is it.
But the city and its schools remained divided between white and black. Yellow buses meant to bring both sides together only drove them further apart. Making the case for busing. We'll go behind the scenes of history. When Dream Deferred, the legacy of busing continues.
In 1972, a Gallup poll showed most Americans, white and black, disapproved of busing as a way to racially balance schools. Busing conjured images of frightened children, angry parents, civil unrest, and overwhelmed school systems. Federal judges who supported it became outcasts in their own communities. Some even blamed it for turning vibrant cities into urban wastelands. But the case for busing was the case for desegregation, and that case was undeniable. By the 1970s, the gathering storm that was busing was as predictable and inevitable in Cleveland as a harsh winter. Most preferred the snow.
It was immensely harsh from the get-go, certainly among the whites.
A generation after Brown, the landmark Supreme Court case that declared separate is inherently unequal, Cleveland's public schools were even more racially divided. Some blamed a population shift known as white flight.
As African-American families moved into areas like Glenville and Mount Pleasant, you know, white families moved out. The school district had nothing to do with that. That was a migration out of the district.
But others believe the continued presence of racially identifiable schools was intentionally caused by the school board and the state.
Cleveland was a segregated city. The Board of Education, in lockstep with the state, helped create this segregation. Teachers were assigned on the basis of race, but it didn't end there. They drew boundary lines along racial lines. They gerrymandered boundary lines. They constructed schools in such a manner to incorporate or capture residential segregation.
So in 1973, the NAACP, led by then General Counsel Nathaniel Jones, filed a lawsuit on behalf of Robert Reed and several other plaintiffs educated by Cleveland Public Schools. Reed versus then Governor James Rhodes was one of many cases filed in response to a growing outcry from NAACP chapters in northern cities.
The quality of education was inferior. The physical plants were a disgrace, and they wanted something done about the conditions. And incidentally, there was an issue raised about the one-race character of the schools.
In court after court, the NAACP introduced paper trails that proved public schools in most urban areas were intentionally segregated. Busing was the standard remedy for school populations that were not racially balanced. In Boston, the violence surrounding court-ordered desegregation was infamous, so much so the NAACP sought to keep the word busing out of Cleveland newspapers.
Some of the African-American leaders of this came into the city rooms of the paper and begged us not to use the term busing. It was pejorative. What should we use? Desegregation. I said, it's too long for a headline.
In another attempt to avoid a crisis, the NAACP first presented its case to Cleveland School Superintendent Paul Briggs. Briggs had a reputation as a reformer, and it was hoped he'd be willing to settle out of court.
He challenged us. He fought us tooth and nail. He argued that the remedies would be too expensive and too expansive. He said it would result in what he called massive crosstown busing.
At the time, busing even divided the African-American community.
There were African Americans who would not say publicly that they were opposed to it, but there were African Americans who felt that crosstown busing wasn't the solution.
Behind the scenes, many of Cleveland's black leaders were hostile to what they saw as outside interference by the NAACP. And there was a lot of tension when both sides met to discuss the case.
They were there to run us out of town and show us that we were not representing the interests of the black community.
We were told our asses would be kicked unless we left. Oh yeah, that was, they made it very clear, and just those terms.
The case was tried before federal judge Frank Battisti. Battisti was a firm believer in two things: the independence of the courts and the Constitution.
Judge Battisti was a very earnest student of the law, and in particular, an earnest student of the Constitution.
I mean, he would talk to me before I was even in law school, and he'd show me a little booklet of the Constitution. He'd go, "Oh, the Constitution," you know, and he'd get all excited.
After 6 months of reviewing all the testimony in the case, Judge Battisti has ruled that the Cleveland Board of Education is liable for causing segregation in the schools, and that the State Board of Education is also liable for that segregation.
Battisti's scathing opinion traced Cleveland's segregated schools back to policies that isolated African Americans on the city's east side, a clear violation of the Constitution's Equal Protection Clause.
There were over 200 separate incidents that were cited by the court that we were able to point out that stood for the proposition that Cleveland schools were intentionally segregated in violation of the 14th Amendment.
The ruling put the city on edge, forcing school officials to make a desperate plea.
We ask all Clevelanders to be calm, to be orderly, and be patient.
The members of the board, even those members of the board were opposed, were very much committed to implementing the court orders peacefully and without disruption.
Cleveland played it different than Boston did. In Boston, they had riots and people throwing rocks at schoolhouses. Cleveland decided that wasn't going to happen in Cleveland, and it really didn't happen in Cleveland.
Battisti included in his ruling a massive plan for education reform in Cleveland.
Obligations that had nothing to do with busing or student assignments, but were intended to improve the quality of education for all students, black, white, red, yellow, and every shade in between.
But it was the judge's rigid mandate for crosstown busing that made headlines. It also made him despised in Northeast Ohio for years to come.
He became a pariah. I mean, he became a no good every word you could utter.
Uncle Frank said separate is not equal. You can't separate people based upon the color of your skin. And it was such a fundamental thing he was trying to get across, and such a fundamental, basic feeling everyone should have wanted.
Efforts to bridge the racial and geographical divide would span the next quarter century, but in many ways, it was a bridge to nowhere.
Are Cleveland schools better off today than before busing? It's a question that has haunted the city for 35 years. For all its good intentions, many believe busing produced bad results that still affect the classrooms today. Others believe busing was a remedy that came years too late and was abandoned years too early.
35 years after court-ordered desegregation, Cleveland public schools remain predominantly African American. There are no all-white schools.
They called what happened in the Cleveland schools de facto segregation. And all these years later, after all that muss and fuss, it is de facto segregated.
It was hoped crosstown busing would be the remedy for generations of unequal opportunity and racial isolation. But by 1992, there was a sense the quality of education in Cleveland had declined, and busing was to blame.
Although the intention, I suspect, of desegregation was to improve the quality of education, I think it took on more the course of integrating the schools. Academic excellence became secondary, and I think that was a failure.
Judge Frank Battisti encouraged the parties of Reed versus Rhodes to reach a settlement. It would maintain the ruling's ambitious goals for education reform, but end crosstown busing.
We were able to reach a settlement agreement which Judge Battisti approved as a consent decree.
I think the court finally threw up its hands and said, this is enough. Whatever segregation that exists was not intentionally caused. The past effects of segregation no longer exist. Therefore, we don't have to do anything.
Battisti died 6 months after the consent decree was entered.
Did he have any regrets? No. He wanted just to be an impartial jurist and do some good in the world. I think there was a white child who, for the first time in his life, met a black child, and he never would have met before, and today they're just best friends. That's what I think good happened. I have to think something really good, really fundamental, good like that happened.
The busing, to me, accomplished nothing good, except to give somebody a victory. Nothing else. I can't think of a good thing that came out of it. That was not a remedy. That was a curse.
Many blame busing for problems that plague the school system today. The Cleveland Metropolitan School District is facing an almost $50 million deficit, despite a drastic restructuring plan that included closing schools and cutting staff.
The financial conditions that we find ourselves in is the result of our inability to pass operating levies. And I think that it was more difficult to pass operating levies when families were, one, spending their own money, putting their children into private schools or parochial schools, and then just some people who were angry that the schools were desegregated.
Busing also opened a revolving door of superintendents and CEOs, beginning with the retirement of Paul Briggs in 1978 after 14 years on the job.
Since 1977 or 1978, we've had 9 or 10 CEOs or superintendents go through the district. I think that the lifespan has been about 4 or 5 years. Dr. Barbara Byrd Bennett would probably serve longer than any other superintendent since the desegregation case.
In December, Dr. Eugene Sanders stepped down after 4 years on the job.
I told him when I met him here, welcome to Cleveland. You are going to be about the 6th superintendent I've welcomed to Cleveland. They normally stay about 2 years or so. Some of them get paid to go away. How long are you going to stay, and when are you going? And, of course, he didn't answer me at all.
Education is no different than sports or business. If you have change in leadership at the top regularly, you are not going to be able to bring about the kind of successes that you need.
Another unintended consequence of busing is poverty. Those who could afford to leave the system, white or black, did. As a result, it has become a system made up mostly of the have-nots. 70% of students in Cleveland public schools today live in poverty, a factor that contributes to the district's persistently low academic achievement. The nightmare consequences of the failed dream of school integration come as no surprise to its strongest supporters.
In our honest review and criticism of the way desegregation was carried out, I think we dare not lose sight of the fact that painful experience was compelled because of the unconstitutional segregation that preceded it.
Busing advocates maintain problems within today's schools may have been mitigated if the courts had allowed desegregation to continue.
We missed the boat because we did not seize the moment. We're paying the price now.
impacts of busing.
But even a brief look at history can offer some profound lessons for the present.
If we continue to have separate schools, and we still are a very segregated city geographically, as long as that continues to persist, we're going to have some children that are going to be lost.
That is not to say children cannot learn in all black schools. After all, they have before. And the products of segregated schools say it can be done again.
There's been some complacency in attitude on everybody's part. The teacher's part, the parents' part. And the biggest victim out of all of it are the children. They're not getting that message. Because I'm an educator now, and I see how those teachers' attitudes influence me. And that attitude was, in spite of the conditions that you're brought here in spite of you're going to get the best education, we're here to give you. Because we're the only ones here to give it to you.
In 1963, the year Cleveland confronted its desegregation crisis with demonstrations, Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his I Have a Dream speech. He envisioned a world in which integration was the norm. In Cleveland public schools, it remains a dream deferred.
We hope you will continue the discussion started here tonight in your homes and in your communities.
You can also do it through our website, newsnet5.com. Good night.
Dream Deferred, the legacy of busing, has been sponsored by your Northern Ohio Toyota dealers.
Excuse me, ma'am. We're asking people not to buy here until the school board has come up with a plan for integrating our schools.
Stand for